One, Hangout is live. Cue the music.
Podcasting from Boston, Massachusetts and Los Angeles, California, this is AVShopTalk, covering the latest audiovisual trends and emerging technologies. This is where the AV pros come to talk shop, with your hosts, Nate Schneider and Jason Griffin.
Okay, welcome to this edition of AVShopTalk Live, the super live episode. And let me just explain what is going on here. So Jason and I started this podcast, AVShopTalk, back in February of 2014. And what do we got, like 8 episodes at this point? Is that what we're up to, Jason? So we got.
I believe so.
Yeah, I think we've got 8 episodes up right now. And this is the second ever Hangout on air. So this is a live broadcast. In addition to the audio podcast that we're doing, we're going to do some video stuff. And this is where we can have some other industry pros from the residential side of integration and the commercial side of integration come in, and we can chat about various topics. And the topic for today is going to be green AV. What is it? Why is it important? How is it implemented? What are some different approaches to green AV? But before we get too far into green AV, I wanted to introduce the gentlemen that took time out of their day to join us, some of which are just waking up for the first time. They're rolling out of bed right now, but I won't mention any names. Josh, okay, I had to mention Josh. He's a trooper. He was not feeling well today, but he wanted to still be on the call, so we appreciate that. But let's kick it off with Anthony Zotti out of Denver. He's a residential guy. You might know him from AV Nation podcasts, the Do-It-Yourself AV Nation podcast. And how you doing out in Denver tonight, Anthony?
I'm doing terrific. I'm happy to be here, guys. Super excited.
All right. You'll bring your residential knowledge to this conversation, and of course,
do what I can.
And of course, we've got Jason, as usual, out in Los Angeles, California. How's it going, Jason?
It's going great, Nate. Excited for the episode and glad to be here as usual. I think it's going to be a good conversation, and I've been looking forward to it.
Awesome. And Josh joining us also from the San Francisco area out in California. I know you're not doing well tonight, so I won't ask you how you're doing, but what's new? What's new with you these days?
Oh, it's all kinds of fun these days, especially with the emergence of AV Crosstalk, which came out of, our Mark and my discussions on AV Shop Talk, so that's been a blast. And being a big part of the Red Band and AV Nation merger has been another big part of my world these days, so it's been good.
Yeah, you've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes, as I understand it, right?
Maybe, doing my fair share, pulling my weight around.
Good review. Okay, and next in line we've got Leonard, and he is joining us from the New York area, and he is with Shem, Milsom, and Wilkie. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So how are you doing tonight, Leonard?
I'm doing great. My day is just ending, as opposed to Josh just starting. And yeah, looking forward to talking to all of you here.
Awesome. Look forward to getting your input from the consulting world as it pertains to green AV. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this was because Tim Albright, which he was supposed to be a guest on the show, but he got stuck on the job site, so he's still out working somewhere at this moment in time. Tim could not join us. But he had me on, I think it was episode 168, was it, of AV Week, and he kicked over a question to me about green AV, and it was something to do with Dropcam and Nest working together. And I think I completely missed the boat on his question to green AV, and it really just got me thinking about green AV and how it's implemented these days. And so I thought, well, let's bring it over to Twitter, and then we had some Twitter conversations going on about green AV, and then that's kind of how these Shop Talk episodes come into fruition. Is basically what we're chatting about on Twitter kind of trickles over into these episodes. So the topic at hand is green AV. So let's go over to Anthony, and we'll start with you on this. I Are you familiar with these restrictions for hazardous substances? I mean, you might have heard the term, ROHS. Is this something that you guys in Resi really care about, or is this something that, you do it when you can, or what's the feeling out at least in the Denver area in the Resi market?
Well, I don't think that it comes up often. There's not a lot of consumer awareness of the restrictions of hazardous waste, and I don't think there's a lot of people who even understand how nasty some of the stuff in our electronics are. And so it's not one of those things that's a common topic. However, we're just outside of Boulder, or Boulder's just outside of Denver, and Boulder is sort of what's a polite way to put it? A hippie enclave. It's absolutely gorgeous, but there is a considerable amount more of environmental awareness in the Boulder area, and we do run into projects where we do have to consider this stuff. So we have to consider the materials that we're using, the amount of energy that our electronics use, how much they consume, and things like that. So it's not necessarily a common thing, but those who are aware of it understand just how serious it is, and tend to stick to their guns.
Gotcha. And just so everybody is aware too, this term ROHS, I'm just going to read a blurb right off the site here, just so we can get some dialogue going. But basically, it's also known as lead-free, and it stands for the Restriction of Hazardous Substances, ROHS, also known as Directive 2002/95/EC, originated in the European Union and restricts the use of 6 hazardous materials found in electronics and electronic products. All applicable products in the EU market after July 1st, 2006 must pass an ROHS compliance test. So ROHS impacts the entire electronics industry and many electrical products as well. Josh, is ROHS something that you guys really care about where you are in the commercial side of things out in the California area? I know each state, each jurisdiction, even jurisdictions within states, across certain boundaries, either geographical or whatever, have different guidelines. Is ROHS something that you care deeply about?
Nope. And the reason for that is because it comes before it comes before it ever hits us. ROHS is the responsibility of the manufacturers to make sure that they're not putting those materials in. It's not a matter of the integrator. It's included in every consultant spec that it has to meet these, all equipment has to meet these needs, and all equipment has to abide by these certain things. But the fact is, that's all taken care of through testing long before the product is ever released, because it has to meet those standards in order to be ROHS certified. So it's not really a big concern for me, because I expect the manufacturers have taken their responsibility to ensure that they've done their due diligence and it meets those standards.
Okay, but
Yeah,
as somebody...
Nate, I'll jump in here for a second. I'll jump in here for a second. I have to say I agree with Josh. When we were kind of preparing for this show, I was thinking about this ROHS, and kind of dawned on me how rarely I actually think of this, because this has been around, like you said, since 2006.
Yep.
It's something that I, as an integrator, kind of take just for granted now. You see the little ROHS symbol on various boxes, the little stickers, and I think Josh hit the nail on the head. We just sort of take it for granted as integrators, and I would assume consultants as well. Maybe Leonard can chime in after I'm done here, but I think for me, it's just something that I assume the manufacturers are taking care of, and that pretty much across the board, we're talking apples to apples with different devices, and maybe if there's manufacturers out there that aren't adhering to this, it's certainly not something that I'm aware of. But I'd be curious, Leonard, coming from a purely a consultant view of the industry, is this something that you even think about, or what are your thoughts on this?
I'll say that the ROHS LEED and Energy Star, to various degrees, really have a very minimal impact in and of themselves. And we'll talk about LEED later. In terms of ROHS, you're absolutely right. 98% of products that would be considered in any kind of real AV project are going to be ROHS compliant. The little ROHS logo is there on them. It's been since before I knew what it was. The case has to be made either that you have a client who personally cares about environmental issues, or there needs to be some kind of return on investment for them. And you don't tend to get it from these kinds of certifications. If you look through all of the ways to get LEED points, and you need 40 points for a basic LEED certification up to 80 to get LEED Platinum, you might be able to squeeze one LEED point out of having all Energy Star equipment, and you might be able to get one LEED point for something like acoustic treatment. That is not going to be what makes or breaks their LEED certification. So that's what's from the beginning in this industry and still makes being green a challenge.
Right, right, and I think that segues perfectly into the next topic that I wanted to touch on was LEED, because to me that's really kind of where we as professionals in this industry first sort of have a real touch point with green and green building. ROHS again kind of precedes us in the process, right? I think we all kind of agree on that. But even when you get into LEED, I mean, it's a very vast topic, and something that most architects are very, very familiar with. But I think in the AV systems integration industries, it's still relatively new, and it's something that we are, kind of trying to find where we fit in this equation. So, I'll go back to Anthony here on the residential side. By the way, Anthony, it's nice to have a fellow resi guy on with us. I usually feel like the only one, so welcome aboard here. I know on the residential side we see these projects come across. What's your experience with LEED, and how prominent of a role do you see integrators playing in this initiative to enhance environmental design?
Well, I think we have our part to play. The U.S. Green Building Council has made it very clear that they don't consider us very important at all, despite the fact that when we're doing an automation system, when we're systems integrators, we could touch on all of the subsystems in the home, the mechanical, i.e. HVAC type stuff, lighting, shades, etc., as well as the draw of our AV gear. We can have a real impact, but the U.S. Green Building Council, I'm not sure what kind of language I can use here. I want to cuss, but they don't tend to give a crap about what we do. And so we tend to get very, very few points, no matter how deep we go. But what we really sell is what I call the warm fuzzy. We're not going to necessarily be able to garner a lot of LEED points with what we do in the residential market, but we could certainly sell that warm fuzzy and have a real impact by just utilizing smart automation systems and clever programming.
The warm fuzzy is a much harder sell in the commercial market.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah. Now LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. I was talking to a friend this week who works at an architecture firm in Boston, and he's LEED alphabet soup after his name. I don't even understand all these different certifications that he's got, and it's something I want to learn more about. But LEED hasn't really been something that I personally have had to worry about a lot in the different roles that I've been in. Leonard, is LEED something that, like, getting LEED points, does this come into your consulting, and to what extent does this come into your consulting?
As I said, very rarely. This is not where LEED points come from.
Okay.
LEED points come from window treatments. They come from lighting. The lighting consultant is one of the biggest players in a lot of the LEED discussions. And then you get things like daylight harvesting. You get window treatments. You get HVAC people. You do not tend to get AV systems. And again, there might sometimes be the opportunity for a lead point. I have almost never seen that happen from AV design.
Okay,
But
so
to go back a sec, the interesting thing there is that of all of those different contractors or contributors to a building that you mentioned, we've touched virtually all of them with our overall control systems. So it's interesting how we really are ignored, and yet we're the ones who build in the intelligence.
Absolutely, we do, and that's where we have an opportunity to make a difference and to do something. And the opportunity has to be to sell, not a certification, not a lead point, but to sell a return on investment that your operating costs will be lower, and your replacement times will be less frequent because you can stop somebody from leaving the TV on or the projector on overnight when they go home. And you can turn off the lights when there's nobody in the room, because we can, in addition to a room-by-room AV control system for you, and specify a building-wide asset management system that also talks to occupancy sensors, that also talks to a scheduling system, that also talks to the lighting system. And that ends up definitely being greener, but there has to be some way to sell it as giving a return on investment, giving them something concrete. It's not warm fuzzies, and it's not going to end up being lead points or ROHS points. I could say this piece, this projector uses such and such chemicals in its lamp, and they'll say, eh. Or I'll say, this laser projector, you don't have to replace lamps. You're going to save yourself this amount of operating cost in maintenance through its life.
How do you quantify that? In the residential market, I would argue that we only have the warm fuzzy because we cannot bring hard numbers to our clients. I can understand where that might be that would be the most attractive selling point is ROI, but that's one of those things that I've argued for many years, and I've been involved in trying to green or be a little bit more eco-conscious in automation systems since 2006. And I'll tell you what, it doesn't matter what pencil I use, what pen I use, I cannot accurately quantify a return on investment. And that's despite the aid that you'll get from vendors and whatnot. But every situation is different, and especially when we start tying various subsystems together, I'm asking a serious question. How in the hell do you quantify that?
I'm going to jump in on that one. When I was working for a manufacturer, one of the last projects I had the opportunity to design was a department store, a very large department store with one of our integrators. And the integrator wanted to utilize our amplifiers, wanted to utilize our DSP, and we were going up against a larger amplifier manufacturer. Literally, for a return on investment, we went through and calculated billable kilowatt hours over a 10-year period based on the city standards for what was going on. So I said, okay, my amplifiers are going to draw this much power per amp. Here's how many you have in your system. Their amplifiers are going to draw this much power per amplifier, and they're requiring this many per system. Notice that ours are going to pay for themselves in 4 years, theirs are going to pay for themselves in 3, but you're going to be paying more energy over time with them because of this and that, because our amplifiers happen to be more expensive up front. So there was an initial increase in cost, and that was something that happened over time. Now, in terms of going even deeper on some of the things that you guys are talking about in terms of control and return on investment, prior to joining the integration firm that I work with now, they did a building here in California, and as everybody knows, California is so green, except for the parts where it's brown because we don't have any rain. What we've got is, the integration firm I worked for worked on a building out here where it is literally a net zero building. They actually are producing more energy than they use. at this point. So they are a pure self-sufficient building at this point. And to Leonard's point, yeah, very little of that actually has to do with the AV equipment because they're running solar panels. They have the recycled water systems. They have all of those things going on. But demonstrating with the AV product that there is a lower power draw, demonstrating that there is either due to Energy Star compliance because it's going to suck less juice when it's not on, or that you can shut it off intermittently or program it to have timered off based on occupancy sensors or timers. All of those things are calculatable in terms of power consumption. In terms of the actual equipment itself, it's a little bit harder to do because with displays, you never know exactly how long they're going to last. I bought a refurbished 42-inch refurbished 32-inch Vizio 3 years ago, and that's something I expected to last me a year and a half. And at this point, I would be amazed if it died at all. But it's one of those things where you never quite know what you're going to get out of it. But there is a calculatable return on investment depending on what it is you're trying to show your client.
I think that's very true. To me, green AV in general is one of these tricky topics. I think where we run into trouble as professional AV people and integrators is when we try to sort of shoehorn things that we're already doing into this model and trying to kind of call it green. I mean, really, if we're honest with ourselves, like if you want a truly green AV system, like don't have an AV system. I mean, but we understand that the spaces and that we work in, AV is an integral part of it. At home, it's very much a part of people's lives, and in the commercial realm, it's literally how the room functions. Conference rooms and convention centers and things of that nature. So it is in the world of true green, the purists look at probably AV as sort of a necessary evil. But I think that it's wise for us as integrators to look at this and figure out, okay, where do we fit in? I'd be curious, being a residential guy, I much more of a CDF follower, but I know Infocom has its STEP program, which is the Sustainable Technology and Environments program. Maybe we start off with Leonard here. Leonard, how familiar are you with this initiative by Infocom? Is this something that you think about and work with on a regular basis, or again, is this just something that kind of sits in the background?
This is something that largely sits in the background. Again, I have to answer to my client, who is usually the architect, and through the architect, the end user, and give them a reason that's going to resonate with them. And when I'm evaluating equipment and choosing equipment, one thing I do look at is power draw. But in terms of either Infocom's STEP program, it's not something that has enough visibility outside of the industry to resonate. Energy Star does. So those amplifier manufacturers who have gotten Energy Star certifications, Extron was one of the first ones. I think that Crown has on a couple of them now. That becomes a differentiator, and that becomes something that you can point to and gives a shortcut to tell your user, yes, this is going to be saving you X over however much time, and then somebody defeats the automatic power shutoff because they don't want to wait for it to cycle back on again, and you're right back where you were.
Yeah, I think the amplifier thing is important. That's definitely something that has been part of the culture, where I work doing system design at ImageStream. And I think when I was initially asked the question about, is green AV important, I think I was confused by it because I guess where I work now, there's this culture of, Leonard, as you said, just kind of like calculating power draws and making sure we're, in the habit of using Energy Star rated amplifiers when we can, and we kind of have this like list of preferred equipment, if you will. I think almost every company I've been to has preferred equipment for various reasons, whether they're getting kickbacks or whether what they know somebody's brother-in-law that works for this manufacturer. There's different reasons why people go to certain manufacturers or pick certain equipment over others. And I think where I am, there's some very talented designers that have already gone through a lot of the scrutinization to pick preferred equipment that is green, and it is the more efficient way to go. And I won't get too far into details with that, but green AV it's almost something. It's like a different mindset for AV design. But that's kind of my perception.
What I see is the bigger change for AV design, and this is one where we can take a page from our friends in the IT industry, and I do this too, when you're pricing a project, how do you price it? You say, okay, there's going to be $2 million worth of equipment, however many $100,000 worth of installation labor, $50,000 worth of programming labor, testing and commissioning. There's your price. And we don't tend to look at operating cost and cost of use. IT gear, most of the money isn't up front. Most of the money is ongoing licensing and ongoing cost of operation. The AV industry is going to be moving that way, especially as software starts to eat hardware. And this is something else where the green AV concept can really take some more root, because we're going to really need to sell not just this is going to cost you $5 million for an AV system, but this is going to cost you $1 million for an AV system and then $150,000 a year to keep it running, or $200,000 a year to keep it running, or $40,000 a year. And that's where people can see the value there, and you don't have to sell it, it's built into what you're presenting to a client.
And now, do you present that as operational cost, or is there some sort of eco footprint tagline or lingo that's going to be thrown around? Maybe I'm not aware of, or how do people what's the language being used when you say here's a $2 million system, and by the way, it's going to cost you $100,000 a year to keep it up and running? How do you communicate that to a client so that it clicks? Is there?
Right now, we most often don't, and that I would say is, to an extent, to our detriment. It's something that at Shen we've had a lot of discussion about, and we have a lot of smart people putting some effort into trying to develop metrics to look at things more holistically. And this is a direction in which the industry is going. It's not going to be the same as it has always been.
Would you even call it the new age consultant, Leonard?
I agree with Leonard. I think that's definitely the way it's going. I think that we'll find that you guys who work in commercial see it first. You have more defined. It's easier to define the usage patterns in a commercial environment, I believe, than in a residential, where client behavior, size of family, just general usage patterns can be highly erratic, where I think that they're probably a little bit more stable or more static in a commercial environment. I'm intrigued because for years I've tried to figure out how the hell I could quantify it. I could certainly determine, BTUs and power draw of various components, but how does one, I've got to figure out a way to do it, because how does one quantify cost savings of, say, a 20% weave on shades over a 10% weave? How does one quantify a return on investment on lighting control dimmers that cost, say, $250, $300, and when do you get your money back, as opposed to putting in just a simple flippy switch that you get for $1.39 at Home Depot?
One thing comes from having better tools, and Nate mentioned a discussion of Nest and Dropcam kicking this off. I just bought a Nest that I'm going to install here as soon as I get a free couple of moments to run a new wire for it. because we only have high voltage wiring for our circa 1950s thermostat. But one thing that Nest will do is it will give you a day-by-day usage history. And if you change something, you can see how it changes. And in the commercial world, I have been specifying the heck out of things like Crestron's Fusion, AMX's Resource Management Suite, Extron's whatever they call it, if it's an Extron system. And all of the big control manufacturers now have tools to measure not only energy usage, but overall utilization. You can make that.
However, that's post-install.
Exactly. That's
Yes.
a post-install thing. So how do you deal with it beforehand? And that's where Revit and BIM families come into play.
I knew we were going to get to BIM.
And I dealt with BIM from the manufacturing side of asking consultants all over the country, is this something you're using? Is this something you're using? Is this something you're using? The response I got back from the AV world was 1 in 25 at the time, about 3 years ago, we're using it.
It's wicked expensive.
It's ridiculously expensive, and it doesn't have the same quick keys as AutoCAD, even though AutoCAD went out and bought it, basically. So the thing with Revit families, for those that are unfamiliar with BIM and what it is building information management. And what it does is it allows you to input families, which are the equivalent to AutoCAD blocks. Only now it's going to contain all of the data, all connector types, all of the BTUs, all of the power draw. All of that information can now be stored within the block. So the Revit program itself will actually start to calculate, okay, well, how many BTUs are going to be consumed in my IT closet, which means I need to provide X amount of coolant for this area in order to do this thing, which goes back to Anthony's question, is how does he calculate, well, is it going to be a 10% weave or a 20% weave? Having that kind of data available to you from, okay, well, we're going to have this much refraction from a shade that is going to do this much and this much reflection from it. So are we going to trap the light in? How much are we repelling out there? How much heat is it going to keep in this room, especially in Denver in the winter? You know, you keep the shades down, you want to keep the heat in, sort of a deal is a secondary idea. But that's where all of this comes into play, is you're looking at something that is an upfront in the design process that can start to give you that information of, if you pay just this much more, we're going to be able to provide you with a solution that does this much more of a thing, which will provide you with this added cell over time. I mean, Leonard's completely valid in specifying and offering people these measurable solutions, but that's like putting the mice in the lab and saying, okay, let's see how they react when we put the cheese over here, and how do they do it when we put it over here. You're going to get, it's a reactionary thing. You're seeing how people react with the equipment as opposed to what they potentially could do and what you could potentially alter in your specification.
Well, there's value in both. And there's absolutely
I'm not
value.
saying there's not value in both at all.
No.
There's completely value in both, but
Now-
it's two different sides.
Now, of course, to get anything useful out of Revit, you know, a lot of the things that you talked about are going to be from the architect and other trades rather than from us. We have a great BIM team. We're not going to have them put in shades and different kinds of window glass. And the architect doesn't want us to. They do that. And then you get the question of, and there's still an issue, where do those Revit families come from? And some manufacturers have terrific Revit families with tons of information available with them. Some of them have what appears to be just a
CAD block.
three-dimensional box
Yeah.
that you could have drawn a rectangle and gotten the same thing. So it's a challenge, but it's definitely another
and that's
just growing puzzle.
well, and that even goes into getting the AV industry to buy into Revit, which it hasn't as a whole yet.
Well, it sounds like you use Revit.
We do not. We are still a CAD house in my place, but because I talked to so many people about the opportunities for this, I've attended many Revit seminars to see the benefits of it and know whether or not, and I've also been tasked at my company with sort of keeping an eye on it to know of, when do we need to make the shift? When do we need to actually make the investment? And
We use both. We use both, and if it's a project of mine and I have a choice, my preference is to use Revit and put our AV stuff directly into the architect's Revit model, which is probably moving a little bit away from this conversation, except that it's another tool.
Yeah, no, it is interesting, and I know just enough about Revit to be familiar with what it is and kind of what the fundamental differences are between that and CAD. But again, it seems to me like it largely depends on what people are putting into it. And I know in the residential world, on a lot of the projects we do, I do work on the high end of the residential market, so I can see certain projects where Revit might make sense, but I can tell you, even in where I operate in the market, it's not something that comes up very often. Everyone is still pretty much operating in CAD, and I'll be curious to see if commercial sort of adopts that first. I don't know, Anthony. I'd be curious to get your
commercial projects are very largely Revit these days.
Yeah.
Almost every architect I've worked with uses Revit for most, if not all, of their projects.
And that's
right.
And you then return files in Revit. It's collaborative in that way then?
Yes. There's a central model, and you pull out of the central model, you add your things to it, and then it reconciles with that central model.
Mm-hmm.
And it really works. What you don't have is the reflected ceiling plan with a light fixture and a ceiling speaker in the same place, because they're on two different drawings or there are different layers turned on.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting conversation, but I do want to kind of bring it back around to green. And the thing is, like, what I was kind of getting at is we could go round and round during the design phase about all these different facets of what we're putting in and how it might affect the overall cost and environmental footprint of operating the system. But for me in the residential world, a lot of times, like, a consumer might look at a TV that may cost them $20, $30, $40 more a year in energy to run, but it looks prettier, and that might be the one that they pick. And I think that's where it's interesting to think about the difference between residential and commercial when it comes to green AV, is that in commercial, it tends to be much more of a business decision. It's dollars and cents, whereas in residential, there's a much more of an emotional connection to the equipment. And so I think it's my opinion, and Anthony, I'm going to ask you to chime in on this, but it's my opinion that in residential, green tends to take more of a back seat than in commercial.
It depends on the client. My current gig where I'm at now, we don't do a lot of it. The closest thing that we come to right now is maybe we monitor energy usage, and we've got the tools to do that. We don't do it on every job by any stretch of the imagination. But I'm in a shop that focuses more on control as opposed to automation. And, in my previous gig, I owned my own company, and I did tweakier work. And it was less focused on AV. It was more focused on automation in general. And I think the biggest, as far as greening, at least in the residential space, I take that back, in both commercial and residential, is in building intelligence into the lighting, the mechanical. Here in Colorado, we live for all intents and purposes in a desert. That's largely because you cats out in California get half our water, but that's a different discussion, very political. But we live in a very dry environment, and so some of the things that I've focused on in the past has been building intelligence into something as simple as your irrigation system, or in monitoring, for example, in someone whose water is actually derived from a well as opposed to from city water, and they may have a slow well and cisterns for storage. We need to know how much water they have, and then where's the water being consumed in the house, and prioritize it. And I've actually built systems like that where we monitor how much water does the building have available at any given moment? How long will it take to refresh? And then prioritize use so that there's, always the ability to flush the toilets, and, refilling the pool or your water features outside are going to be deprioritized and disabled. So I think things like that, water consumption, how do you run your mechanical, building intelligence into your heating and air conditioning, your shades, your lighting, that's where the real benefits are. And then, Jason, you hit the nail on the head. AV is very emotional. It's, at least in the residential space, it's very emotional, and it's less of a discussion.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think depending on what industry you're in, whether you're more residential or commercial, and depending on the needs of the specific client too, I think what I'm gathering from this discussion is that green AV is kind of slightly different to slightly different people, and I don't know that. So if I ask the question right now, what is green AV, and I ask each one of you, and I think as we close this discussion, I think that's what I'm going to kick back to you guys, is just to give your final thoughts on how would you define AV. If you could define what green AV is in a sentence, how would you do it? And I guess I'll start. I think it's a combination of picking gear that consumes power efficiently. I think that's part of the equation, but it's definitely not the whole solution. I think it has to do with creatively writing code so that your control processors maybe do some extra things to save power when they can. I think it has to do with lead. I think lead can come into play, but it's not defined by lead necessarily when you're talking about green AV. I mean, it could come into play, but that's definitely not the full answer. I think green AV is a little bit amorphous, and it can mean different things. At least that's kind of where I'm at with it right now. Anybody else want to tackle the question, what is green AV in summary here?
Sure. One thing I'll say is that it's a mindset that the footprint on the planet matters. I'll say that even if there's not a direct business case, if all other things are equal, it does matter to me, and I try to be mindful of it in designs. It is picking gear that's more efficient and monitoring things in a way that's more efficient. And another thing we haven't really touched on is that it could also be how we work. It could be calling into an out-of-state meeting instead of driving there. It could be taking the subway instead of a cab, or marking up PDFs instead of printing out full-size progress sets every week. And that's another way that we can lead by example, that we can watch our own footprint, and again, try to look at our impact on the larger world.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, one of the things I like to do is carpool with a guy that lives near me. So we carpool as much as we can, and it saves us some money, and it's one less car driving on the road, and it's a good thing. And I don't think it's going to save the world or anything, but you do what you can, and you try to make the world a better place, right? Josh, do you have any final thoughts here about how you would define green AV in a nutshell?
Well, before I give you my final thoughts, I do want to touch on something that Jason and Anthony both talked about, which is the emotional experience of AV. And I want to bring that up specifically because my debate partner, Mr. Coxon, was quoted in the New York Times today, specifically regarding 4K displays. And one of the statements that he was quoted as saying was, if you want to buy a 4K display, put one next to a 1080p, and whichever one you think looks better, I guarantee you'll be happy with the result. And it was just, it rang so true with what Jason said. I wanted to make sure that Mark got the love that he rightfully deserved for that comment. That,
that's awesome.
You can pick up in tomorrow. Yeah, you can pick that up tomorrow in hard copies for New York Times tomorrow, Mr. Mark Coxon. But as my final thoughts for green AV, I don't know that I'd call it completely amorphous. I think green AV has a very particular definition, and I think the first thing that jumps to mind for most people is the energy efficiency factor. Now, what energy efficiency means is an entirely different issue, and that's where the definition can change. How is the control system operating? What is the gear being used? What is the consumption of it? But it is a small part, and and that's something that comes up a lot in regards to how we operate our systems. Take Leonard's additional comment on adding remote communication capability. I mean, that is corporate AV right now. Every room gets the video conferencing system. Every room has the capability of connecting for Hangouts. I mean, we are participating in a green AV event at this very second because we are across the country, and we are chatting in a way that we are trying to impart, some sort of information to people without consuming a ton of energy. So we are ourselves being green AV professionals right now in some small respect.
All right.
But it does really come down to what kind of energy are you consuming? How does it operate? Does it operate? And the biggest factor when it comes to energy consumption of devices is standby. It's that Energy Star issue of what are they doing when they're not actually in use. That's the biggest factor when it comes to looking at green AV and what devices are going to apply.
Okay, good final thoughts here. Anthony, we'll jump over to you, and then we'll let Jason have the last word here and close things out. But what is green AV?
I'll pretty much just reiterate what I said. I don't think green AV is that significant. I think looking at a home or building holistically, you can make really significant changes. If we look at the AV portion alone, we can make small incremental changes. And I think it's important that we're mindful of that and we do so. But I tend to look at the whole building and then, like I said, building that intelligence over many different subsystems and getting them to work together. I think that's where the biggest change can be made.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think Anthony hit the nail on the head here, and I think it's interesting just to see the divide between kind of, and I don't think it's a wide gulf, but I do feel like the guys, Anthony and I coming from the residential side, and then there's the commercial side, and it is that was one of my big takeaways from tonight is that I think in residential, if we're honest with ourselves, it kind of takes more of a back seat, whereas in commercial, it's much more of a business decision, and it's dollars and cents. It's something that you can more easily quantify. I think for me, as somebody who operates in the residential side, green AV is not that big of a deal. I think maybe the subtle point that Anthony's getting at is it's more about the integration and kind of the overlay of what we're able to do with our automation systems where we can make a difference. And perhaps that's just semantics. I mean, a lot of us, when we say we do AV, we're including integration in that. It's part of it, and we kind of know that. But I think it's a subtle point, but one that's important to think about. So with that, I think we can wrap it up. Nate, I'll kick it back to you. I don't know if you have anything else, but I think it's been a great conversation.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I did want to mention that at the beginning of the episode, I neglected to tell people how they can interact with us. So I'll just mention it now for anybody that's watching this, maybe not live or watching it, in the next weeks or months or whatever. It's going to be posted up to the AVShopTalk YouTube channel. And if you think we missed something or you want to add to the conversation, please do. Please tweet at AVShopTalk and let us know your thoughts on green AV. And also in the Q&A section, I think the Q&A just kind of turns into comments after this video live broadcast ends. But also, yeah, feel free to let us know in the comments of this video as well. And I think that about wraps it up. Thank you guys for joining us and having this discussion. And I think we all learned a lot, and I think we gotta keep learning and see where things go and change accordingly to trends in the industry, and I guess know when to keep that green AV mindset to the forefront, depending on what the client's needs are, and do what you can when you can afford to do it, right? Because I think there's we kind of all have a conscience in the back of our mind that we want to do things because it's the right thing to do, but the money in the budget might not be there to let us do that. So it's kind of the balancing act you have to do as a designer. And with that, we will wrap things up. Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of AV Shop Talk Live. Have a good night.